We want to continue where we left off last time, exploring Mashiach ben Yosef, and we want to get a little more Talmudical this time and focus on that passage in the Gemara that's very troubling, that's very difficult to understand. So, quick recap from what we said last time, that there's this concept of the warrior Messiah, supposed to fight this enemy at the end of days. We said that he doesn't have to die. We saw how Psalm 118 is really supposed to be about, as the Zohar says, Psalm 118 is about Mashiach ben Yosef, and it says there, Lo amut ki echyeh, he doesn't have to die, he's going to live. And we saw the origin in the Torah is Jacob's blessing of Ephraim, and he put his right hand on the little one, right, and said the little one will be something special. So that's an allusion to Mashiach ben Yosef, Ephraim being literally the son of Yosef in the Torah. So that's like the earliest allusion to Mashiach ben Yosef. And then we saw how Jeremiah chapter 31 is all about Mashiach ben Yosef. And there's 4 stages of Mashiach ben Yosef of that era, as explained by the Vilna Gaon, as brought down in a book called Kol HaTor, which goes into Jeremiah chapter 31, and gives 4 stages to this Mashiach ben Yosef era. Right? And the first stage was called Har Ephraim, which is the ingathering of the exiles, and that's said to have been accomplished once 600,000 Jews are back in Israel, which has already happened. And then the second stage is called Ephraim Mitnoded. These are all terms that come from Yirmiyahu, from the 31st chapter. And that's the 999 birth pangs of the Messiah. That's where the Jewish people experience a series of hardships and travails and tests and challenges and struggles and wars and things like that. And it seems like we are in that phase right now. The second phase of the Mashiach ben Yosef process, which is called Ephraim Mitnoded. And then stage 3 is called, like Kol HaTor says, Haben Yakir Li Ephraim, and that's when the actual person, Mashiach ben Yosef, is essentially revealed. And then finally, the 4th stage is when he actually battles this enemy who is called Armilus. That's the title, Armilus. And we saw how they even have the same numerical value, how Ephraim and Armilus are both 331, because one is supposed to neutralize the other. So they have the same numerical value, because one balances out the other, defeats the other, neutralizes the other. So that's what we said last time, those 4 stages. And this time we want to actually focus on that 4th stage, that final confrontation with Armilus and what's going to happen to Mashiach ben Yosef. And last time... We're in stage 2, it looks like, in the period of travails. Et tzarahi Yaakov, which actually has a value of 999. It's the 999 birth pangs. So before stage 3, when Mashiach ben Yosef, the person, is revealed. That's where we're at, it seems like. So we want to focus now on that Talmud in Masechet Sukkah, which talks about that final battle between Mashiach ben Yosef and Armilus, and what happens to him based on verses in Zechariah in the Tanakh. Okay, and that's what we want to explore. We also want to look at, where did this whole idea of Mashiach ben Yosef really come from? Where is it explicitly mentioned first? We saw that in the Tanakh, it's never actually explicitly mentioned. This term Mashiach ben Yosef does not appear in any scriptural source. So where is it first mentioned? And who said that there's 2 messiahs? Since when are there 2 messiahs? The Tanakh seems to always speak about just one. So where did that idea come from? And again, make the same disclaimer we made last time, which is that anytime you talk about Mashiach, you basically have to reiterate that it's obvious that Mashiach has not yet come, right? Because there are many groups of people, various people, who believe that their particular guy is the Messiah, and he already came and died or whatever and will be back, and everybody's waiting for their guy to come back. So it's obvious that Mashiach hasn't come. It's obvious because nothing that it says in Scripture about the Messianic age has come true. None of it. None of it has come true. Not the world peace, not beat your swords into plowshares, not the simple fact that it says in many places that there will be an international house of God on the Temple Mount, right? There will be a Beit Tfilah lechol ha'amim. There will be a Beit Tfilah, a house of prayer lechol ha'amim, for all the nations of the world. Isaiah says it, Zechariah says it. They all say after Mashiach comes in the Messianic age, the Temple Mount will be an international place of prayer. That clearly is not a thing today. Today, if you're not Muslim, you are not allowed.
What happened to the mosque over there?
Right now, the Temple Mount is basically reserved only for Muslims. If you're not Muslim, you're not allowed to pray there. The Waqf controls it. Jews are not allowed to go there. It's Judenrein. So how could it be? And when Jews do try to go there, they always get abused and arrested and whatever. It's ridiculous. The whole thing is silly, that Jews can't go to their own holiest site. And Christians too. Nobody can pray there other than Muslims. So obviously these prophecies in Scripture have not been fulfilled. So it's obvious to anybody who knows even a little bit of Tanakh that we are not in the Messianic age. Mashiach has not come. So we always have to say that because too many groups of people think their guy is the Messiah. And as a general rule, like the way that Tanakh describes it, when Mashiach comes, it'll be obvious to everybody that this person's Mashiach. There will be such great miracles. Like Jeremiah says that the miracles will be even greater than those that happen in Egypt. Like we just had Pesach, we did the Seder, we commemorated the plagues and the miracles in Egypt, and they're so amazing. And Jeremiah says that's nothing compared to what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. In fact, we're not even going to commemorate the Pesach Seder. We're going to have a new Seder to commemorate the even bigger miracles that are going to happen when Mashiach comes. So it's going to be obvious to everybody around the world. So as a general rule, if you have to convince somebody that your guy is the Messiah, then he's probably not the Messiah, right? Like it's not, you don't have to convince anybody. When Mashiach comes, it'll be obvious. The whole world will recognize that this person is the one. The whole idea of having a missionary or somebody who has to convince you that this guy is the Messiah is an oxymoron. Mashiach does not need missionaries by definition. So that's the general rule. If you have to convince somebody to believe in your Messiah, then your guy is not the Messiah. It's that simple. So we have to say that. And two more points that I promised that I would address because a lot of people were asking about it just very quickly. Number one is, okay, when that Mashiach comes, how will we really know who is a good candidate for Mashiach? And we already talked about this before. We had a class a couple of years ago on who is Mashiach, and we did like 5 points. And one of those points was that he has to be like a genuine Talmid Chacham, somebody who actually knows Torah in a very deeply profound depths, unlike anything that ever was before. And this one's really important because a lot of people are sending me emails saying, what do you think about this guy? What do you think about this guy? What do you think about this guy? Like, this guy's so smart, and this guy has so much wisdom, and this guy is like a computer. And yeah, like if a person has a lot of Torah knowledge, that's great. That doesn't make them Mashiach. It makes them a hard drive of information. So you can be a hard drive of Torah content, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are Mashiach. And in fact, King Solomon says something amazing, right? You know how King Solomon wrote 3 books? He wrote Shir HaShirim, right, the Song of Songs. He wrote Mishlei, Proverbs, and he wrote Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. He wrote these 3 great philosophical works. And if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, you know that it has a very negative tone. It's so negative that our sages wanted to take it out of the Tanakh. It's like really history's first existentialist philosophical text, right? Like, what is the purpose of life? Throughout the whole book, the common refrain is Hevel Hevelim, right? Everything is vain. Vanities, nothing matters. Life is meaningless, right? Over and over again, he keeps saying Hevel, 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 Hevel. Everything is vain. What does that mean, right? How could he say that? So the Midrash explains, what does that really mean? Kohelet Rabbah says something amazing. What does that mean when King Solomon says that everything is vain? And it says something beautiful. It says, Torah she'adam lamed be'olam hazeh, the Torah that you learned now, Hevel hi, is vain, lifnei Torato shel Mashiach. That's what King Solomon was saying. That the Torah that you're learning now is like nothing compared to the Torah of Mashiach. Meaning the Torah of Mashiach will be so profound, it'll be so mind-blowing, that it'll be like everything you learned till now is like, it's nothing. It's hevel. It's like breath. It's like emptiness. It's vain. That's how profound the Torah of Mashiach is supposed to be. Right? And it's fitting that King Solomon said this because King Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. So he knew all of Torah, and he probably got to a point where he hit a wall and he's like, no Torah, nothing interesting anymore. He's listening to all these rabbis and nobody's doing it anymore. And he's just like, this is all hevel, right? Nothing is stimulating. Nothing is exciting or stimulating anymore. When am I going to get some real Torah? And he's saying when Mashiach comes, the Midrash is saying, King Solomon meant when Mashiach comes, then he'll hear some real Torah, right? right now, even the world's greatest mind, King Solomon, is saying, right now this Torah is boring me. I want something really deeply stimulating. So it's fitting that King Solomon is saying this. So the point is, again, you will know when Mashiach comes because the Torah will be so mind-blowing that it'll be like nothing before it. It's not going to be the same old. And for now, so far, all the people who claim to be Mashiach, none of them really had anything particularly mind-blowing, despite what they might say. Lubavitchers say, oh, the Rebbe had such mind-blowing, Yeah, I admire the Lubavitcher Rebbe too, but it wasn't mind-blowing. It wasn't something totally revolutionary. He had some amazing insights. He had a lot of Torah, no doubt. He was an incredible mind. But was it totally unlike anything ever before? No, it was more or less like before with improvements, So somebody also, they have this, the Lubavitchers have this Torat Menachem. They're publishing all of the Rebbe's Torah. And it's like, I don't know how many volumes it is already. You've seen this? It's like multi-volume. There's at least like 70 volumes of this Torat Menachem. It's like the Torah of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So one Lubavitcher was telling me recently, you see all this? Doesn't this prove to you that he's Mashiach? And I said, no, it just proves to me that he was the leader of Chabad for over 40 years and had a lot to say over 40 years, and all his disciples painstakingly wrote down every single word he ever said and copied every single letter he ever wrote. So yeah, that's 40 years plus worth of Torah, but that doesn't prove that he's Mashiach. It just proves that he's, Right, so we need to get to that. Same thing with Christians, right? They think that Jesus's Torah was somehow revolutionary. Right? But it really wasn't. Jesus didn't say anything new. Most of what Christians think was Jesus wasn't Jesus. His main kind of golden sayings, the key quotes that are attributed to Jesus are not him. He was just citing earlier things. The meek shall inherit the earth. Beautiful. But that's from Tehillim. That's King David said. Anavim yirshu aretz. Right? The meek shall inherit the earth. That wasn't Jesus. That was King David, right? Or the golden rule, or love your fellow as yourself. That's from Vayikra. That's Leviticus. That's not Jesus. That's Moses in the Torah. And the golden rule was Hillel, right? Hillel's the one who said, treat others the way you want to be treated. And we know that Jesus was really a student of Hillel, most likely, because Hillel died in the year 10. And Hillel was the president of the Sanhedrin when Jesus was a child. And if you read the New Testament with Jewish eyes, you see that multiple times Jesus is actually really just quoting Hillel. And sometimes he's quoting Shammai, by the way. For instance, when it comes to marriage, right? Jesus famously said, didn't like the idea of divorce. And Jesus criticized divorce and said, what God put together, no man should separate. But Shammai said the same thing. We know there was a famous debate between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel permitted divorce for any reason. You're not happy, get divorced. But Shammai said, no, absolutely not. You basically can't get divorced unless there was adultery or something like that completely destroys the marriage. So in that case, Jesus is really just quoting Shammai. So you can see if you read the New Testament with a Jewish lens, there's actually a group of Jewish scholars produced a book called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is fascinating if you're interested in this, where they basically go through the New Testament and cite it with all the Jewish things. So it's this came from here in the Tanakh, this came from here in the Mishnah. So Jesus didn't really say anything new. He was very much saying contemporary things that were being said by other people in his day.
What's it called?
The Jewish Annotated New Testament. It's a fascinating book, and what I also like is at the end of the book, there's dozens of different essays about that time period. So if you're interested in that time period, it's a good book to check out.
So that Jesus said anything when...
Right, assuming. Yes. Assuming he actually, of course, assuming that he actually said those things. Yeah. We're going to pretend like the New Testament is actually a collection of his teachings. So he said things that were already being said. We did a whole series on the Apocrypha, if you remember, the book of Jubilees, the book of Enoch, and those things as well. A lot of things that Jesus said were in those books, which were really popular in the Second Temple era. So he didn't really say anything new. Mostly what he was doing was he was confronting the corrupt authorities of his day, because at that time we know the authorities were really corrupt. The temple was corrupt. We know that too. That wasn't something that only Jesus said, right? The temple was very much corrupt. It was controlled by Kohanim, these kind of priests who were all about the money and all this stuff. And Yeah, exactly. So we know that the Essenes had previously left Jerusalem and went to live out in the caves and in the countryside. And the Mishnah actually says that when Hillel was the president, there was a person named Menachem who was the vice president. And the Mishnah says, Yatza Menachem nichnas Shammai, that Shammai replaced a person called Menachem. And there's this person called Menachem the Essene. And Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan actually does a lot of research on who this figure was. And one of the Essene leaders was somebody who left the Sanhedrin and left the temple, left Jerusalem because he was fed up with all the corruption. And this actually leads me to point number 2, because people are asking me to address the fact that it says in the Gemara, in Masechet Yomah, and I mentioned this once briefly a couple of years ago, but it says in the Gemara that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, all the miracles in the temple stopped. And 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the red string that they would tie to the goat, the famous 2 goats that they had, one to Azazel and one that they would slaughter. So they would tie a red string, and the red string would miraculously turn white on Yom Kippur to signify that God forgave the people for their sins. And the Gemara says in Masechet Yoma, Tanu Rabbanan, 40 shana kodem churban habayit, 40 years before the temple was destroyed, lo haya goral ole bayamin, velo haya lashon shel zehorit malbin. So 40 years before, that string was not turning white anymore. Okay, velo haya ner ma'aravi dolek, and the western light would not perpetually stay burning. And vayud daltot ha'echal niftachot, and the temple doors would just constantly open for some reason, unlock and swing open on their own. Very bizarre. So 40 years before the temple was destroyed already, God was no longer showing the people that he forgave their sins. So Christians love this Talmud because they're saying, you see, look, the Talmud confirms what we're saying is true, because Jesus was crucified roughly around, presumably, around this time, about 40 years before the temple was destroyed. So Christians say, you see, look, you killed Jesus and God no longer forgave you for your sins, and the temple was destroyed. Now, what was really happening? If you read that Talmud, it says that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was a student of Hillel. Actually, the Gemara says that he was the least of the students. Hillel had 80 students, and the greatest was Yonatan ben Uziel, and the least of them was Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Yochanan ben Zakkai would later be the president of the Sanhedrin. So Yochanan ben Zakkai would have been probably a contemporary, roughly lived around the same time as Jesus also. And he said that at that time, already 40 years before the temple was destroyed, he said to the temple, Eichal mipnei ma ata mav'it atzmecha. So he started to confront the temple, and he said, Yodeh ani becha shesofcha atid leicharev. Like, we know that you're going to be destroyed. The temple is already too corrupt, it's going to be destroyed. Ukvar nitnabe alecha Zechariah ben Ido, because the prophet Zechariah, who we're going to turn to soon, actually already prophesied that second temple would be destroyed. Zechariah was one of the last prophets. He was one of the prophets that was there when the second temple was built. He was one in the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. So Zechariah helped to build the second temple. And he already prophesied that temple would be destroyed as well. It's a verse in chapter 11, verse 1, and where he said, Patach levanon dlatecha v'tochal esh be'arazecha, that the temple's doors would open and fire would burn the trees, that the lumber, the structure of the temple, which was built with cedars of Lebanon. Right? We know that. The temple was built with cedars of Lebanon, and Zechariah already said in chapter 11, he already prophesied that the second temple would be destroyed, and the cedars of Lebanon that make up its structure would burn down. And the Gemara says, why was the temple called Levanon? Because Shemalbin avonotein shel Israel, because it would whiten the sins, it would atone for the sins of Israel. So Levanon means whiteness, right? So it was Malbin, their sins. Point is that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai also, who lived at the same time as Jesus and who was a student of Hillel, was also saying at the same time that the temple would be destroyed. So it's nothing new. The Talmud is not afraid to say something like this because it was just a fact. It has nothing to do with Jesus, that That's the important thing to understand. So people were asking me to address that point. How do you deal with that Gemara? And it's very simple to deal with. We know from all sources, including our own Talmudic sources, that the late Second Temple authorities were corrupt. The Gemara even rebukes the Pharisees. And we talked about that before as well, that the Gemara says there were 7 types of Pharisees and they were all wicked. So the Gemara doesn't like the Pharisees at that time, doesn't like the Sadducees, doesn't like the priests of the time. We all understand that it was corrupt and it was destined to be destroyed, with or without Jesus. Okay, so it was important to say that. And Jesus didn't say anything particularly new. And by the way, I've mentioned before this book called Jesus and the Zealots, and I think it's worth reading. It was written by S.G.F. Brandon, who's a Christian pastor who looked really into the historical Jesus and argues that he was a zealot. He was one of the Kanaim. He was one of the most ultra-Orthodox people in his day. And later on, he was mythologized into this other figure, into this pacifist and into this somebody totally different.
That's what I'm trying to say, that he actually wasn't, he was actually a good Jew, and he died a good Jew?
Right. That's the idea, yeah. And he's arguing that, you can take he says a lot in his book, but the point of the book is that Jesus was a zealot. And the name of the book is Jesus and the Zealots. The Zealots are mentioned in our sources too, the Kanaim who were like very stringent. They came from the school of Shammai. They were a group within the school of Shammai who were ultra extremist.
This Christian pastor didn't see the Gemara that talks very badly about it.
He doesn't touch the Gemara at all. In this book, he doesn't look at the Gemara at all. He's just looking at it strictly from historical sources. Yeah, and he picks apart the New Testament as what's the early sources, what was written later, because the New Testament itself presents a very confused picture of Jesus. Depending on which gospel you read, you have a very different Jesus. Yeah. So anyway, it's an interesting book. Okay, so that was a little introduction. Now let's get to the actual meat of what we wanted to talk about, which is continue our Mashiach ben Yosef journey. Now, first of all, where can we see in Tanakh the notion of multiple messiahs or multiple saviors or whatever you want to call it at the end of days? Do you have a verse in mind that would support the notion of more than one Mashiach? The prophet Ovadia, who's one of the Trei Asar, one of those what so-called minor prophets, it's one short chapter, and at the end, we say this verse often. Ovadia at the end says, "Ve'alu Moshiim behar Tzion," that saviors, Moshiim, will arise on Mount Zion. Lishpot et Aresav ve'ayta ele Hashem amlucha. And then the kingdom of God will come when saviors arise.
So that's not Mashiach. That doesn't...
Right, so that doesn't necessarily mean Mashiach. It says Moshiim, saviors. Okay, who are these saviors? We don't know.
Idea.
Could be. Now, Zechariah says, and that's what you were saying, there's a verse in Zechariah where he famously talks about the 4 craftsmen, Arba'a Charashim, that God showed him, Ve'yareni Hashem Arba'a Charashim. Now, when you read that chapter 2, it seems to speak of these 4 craftsmen in a negative way. Okay. Not clear exactly, are these good or are these bad? But the Gemara actually takes that verse and says, these 4 craftsmen are an allusion to 4 messianic figures. So it's in Masechet Sukkah. We're going to focus on the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah, page 52. Vayareni Hashem arba'a charashim. What does that mean? Who are these? Man ninhu arba'a charashim. Who are these 4 craftsmen? Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida. These 4 people are Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, Eliyahu, and Kohen Tzedek. These are the 4. So Mashiach ben David, good, we know. Mashiach ben Yosef, okay, we know a little bit about that now. Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet who never died and who we expect to come back. And we know he needs to come back because you need a genuine prophet to anoint a king. So Eliyahu and Kohen Tzedek. The Kohen Tzedek who is he? The Kohen Tzedek is some righteous priest. We need a priest. Why do we need a Kohen?
To officiate the service.
Right, because you're going to want to rebuild the temple. We need a 3rd temple. And for a temple, you need a high priest. You need a Kohen. Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef are not descended from the priestly line, so they cannot be priests. You need a priest. You need a Kohen. You need a descendant of Aaron. So if you're a Kohen, I'm sorry to tell you, you can't be Mashiach, but you could be the high priest in the temple. When Mashiach comes, you can serve in the temple. You can be the Kohen Tzedek. And remember, in the Torah itself, in the Chumash, the word Mashiach only appears in reference to the Kohen. The term is a Kohen HaMashiach. That in the Torah itself, in Vayikra, when the word Mashiach appears, it's only in reference to Kohen Mashiach, the anointed high priest. Because the high priest was also anointed with that anointing oil. Mashiach means the anointed one. So you have like 4 figures here, Eliyahu, and 3 that are anointed. Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, and the Kohen Tzedek. The Talmud then brings another verse from the prophet Micha. Okay, Micah says, chapter 5. It goes like this. Va'ata Bethlehem Ephrata, tzayir liyot be'alfei Yehuda. So this city of Bethlehem, we know Bethlehem, which is today in Yehuda, what some call the West Bank. And that, although that's not the original Bethlehem, that was a rebuilt Bethlehem, rebuilt by, I believe, Constantine, the Roman Emperor Constantine. The original Bethlehem doesn't exist anymore. It got destroyed. The biblical Bethlehem doesn't exist. But he's saying, you, Bethlehem, Mimcha li yitzeh liyot moshel be'Yisrael. That's where Christians get the whole nativity scene. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, even though he was a Nazarene. It's kind of confused. But the idea is they needed to say that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of this prophecy. So he's saying, from you, from Bethlehem, will come out a ruler of Israel who I have already appointed mikedem mimei olam, from the first days of creation. And last time we already quoted the Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah that says, on the first day of creation already, Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, the Spirit of God that was hovering over the waters on the first day of creation is an allusion to Mashiach, as it says in the Midrash. So we're not going to go back to that. Okay, good. Micah continues and he says, Vayaza shalom ashur ki yavo be'artzeinu. When Assyria will invade our land, God will raise up 7 shepherds and 8 princes. Now, the context here, Micha is talking about what was happening 2,500+ years ago in the time of Hezekiah. And I've mentioned this before, that most of the prophecies in Isaiah and in Micah that are talking about some messianic figure, it's really, the pshat is that it's really talking about Chizkiyahu HaMelech, King Hezekiah. He did fight off the Assyrians. If you remember, Sancherib sent a huge army and he was unable to conquer Jerusalem, and God sent an angel and struck down the Assyrian camp. So all of this was already fulfilled in the time of Hezekiah by Hezekiah. And we even said in Sanhedrin, there's an opinion that the rabbis say, Ein Mashiach liYisrael ki kvar achluhu b'yamei Chizkiyahu. There is no Mashiach because Hezekiah was Mashiach. That all the prophecies in Tanakh that talk about Mashiach is really talking about Hezekiah. That's the pshat. The pshat is that it was all about Hezekiah. But we know that the Tanakh is not just a historical text, it's a prophetic text. And it also has something to teach us about the distant future. And so this is always read as a double level, what's called a double level prophecy. That yes, on the one hand, it was fulfilled 2,700 years ago, but also it's alluding secretly to the future time. So it's a double-level prophecy. Okay, so Micha is saying that God will raise up 7 shepherds and 8 princes. Who are these people? To go along with Mashiach, this ruler. Who are these people? The Gemara continues. Man ninhu. Who are these Shiv'a Roim? Who are the 7 shepherds? Take a guess. Who are they? Okay. Good. You already know this Gemara. How many times did you study Sukkah? So, David ba'emta. So, King David is in the middle. Adam shetu metushelach miyamino. So, 3 people from the pre-Noach generations. So, Adam, Seth, and Methuselah, Metushelach, who had the longest lifespan in the Torah, 969 years. And then, Avraham, Yaakov, Moshe bismolo. Abraham, Jacob, Moses on his left, on the left of King David. Those are the 7 shepherds that are going to come back to help Mashiach do his thing. Uman ninhu shmona nesichei Adam. And who are the 8 princes of men? These 8 princes. Do you remember this one? This is harder. Ishai, the father of King David. Shaul, right, the first king of Israel. Shmuel the prophet. Amos the prophet. Tzfanya the prophet. Tzidkiyahu, who was one of the last king of Israel, the last king of Judah, I should say.
But Shaul after he was disgraced?
Yeah, he's going to come back. He was still a tzaddik. And Mashiach and Eliyahu. So these are the 15 people that are going to come back. Now, it seems like there's two messiahs here as well, because there's the original Moshel Be'Israel, plus another, it mentions Mashiach again. So you could say one was Mashiach ben David, one is Mashiach ben Yosef. Another way to read it is, where's Mashiach ben Yosef here? There's somebody missing from this list. Who's missing from this list?
You said a few.
Who's the main one that's missing? Yitzchak is missing. Where's Yitzchak? You have Avraham and Yaakov. Where's Yitzchak? You have Moses here. You have David. Where's Yitzchak? What happened to the other patriarch, right? Where's Yitzchak?
Swapped out.
By who? Why is Yitzchak not here? Think about what Yitzchak did in his day. Yitzchak went up Har Moriah and was willing to be sacrificed. He was willing to give up his life. Why? What was the whole point of that? On a Kabbalistic level, what God wanted Avraham to do is actually to usher in the Messianic age. Yitzchak was the first kind of potential Mashiach. And he was willing to give up his life to kind of conquer all death. It sounds like Mashiach ben Yosef, no? The whole idea of somebody who's giving up, who's suffering, the suffering servant who's willing to give up his life to usher in the Messianic age. That is the whole concept of Mashiach ben Yosef. So Yitzchak is really seen as the first possible Mashiach ben Yosef. And what's really amazing if you like Gematria is the numbers work out beautifully, because if you do Yitzchak in Gematria, Yud, Tzadi, Chet, Kuf, 10, 98, 100 is 208. And if you do Gematria Ben Yosef, Ben is 52, Yosef is 156, Ben Yosef is 208. So actually Yitzchak and Ben Yosef have the same numerical value.
But
So
if you see
Yitzchak,
it, I don't understand. I'm having trouble.
remember, this is Miyamei Olam. This is from the first, God already produced the souls of Mashiach.
If
Yeah.
Yosef wasn't here,
Because it was good. We're going to answer that question. So why is he called Ben Yosef? So we saw that, well, because there's Ephraim, who was the Ben Yosef. That's really where the name comes from.
That makes more sense.
But let's see. There might be a more controversial answer. Let's leave that. Hold on. We're still warming up. But the Gematria of Yitzchak and Ben Yosef is the same. They're both 208. So actually, Yitzchak is Mashiach ben Yosef. It's the same idea. It's the same person. Potentially. That's another way of looking at it. So you have all these 15 people. Now, for the ladies, there are some women too. Okay, so it's not just 15 guys. There is at least 2 or 3 women. They're not mentioned here, but they're mentioned in the Zohar. We spoke about it before. I'm not going to go through it again, but the Zohar mentions Mashiach's wife, that she's just as important to support him. So that also disqualifies Jesus, who was never married, and others who were never married. So a lot of people who think they are Mashiach send me emails. And no, like every day, like literally every day. Like today I got one, yesterday I got one. Like,
Why would they need to confirm with you?
actually today I got 2. Today I got 2. Yesterday I got 2.
He's calling you to confirm and say, hey. But
That's the funny thing. Yeah, I don't know why they want to talk to me.
No,
Like,
you got Ben Yosef and Ben David today.
anyway, but there's a pattern among most of these people, not all of them. Most of these people who think they're Mashiach tend to be single guys living still with their parents. But they think that they're Mashiach. So if you're not, and I actually tell them that I try to reply to almost everybody, except those that are completely incoherent, and I don't know even how to reply. And usually I'll tell them, in the meantime, try to get married, that's kind of like a necessary step to being Mashiach. You can't be like a single guy. Anyway, Mashiach's wife plays a really important role, and the Zohar says that together they're able to outwit the serpent. There's also discussion in the Zohar and in other books about the mother of Mashiach, not the Virgin Mary, but the mother of Mashiach. There's a woman called Mevaseret Tzion, which is straight out of Isaiah. Ishayahu speaks of the herald of Zion, a woman who's going to proclaim the redemption. And she's referred to as Mevaseret Tzion. I don't know how, does that mean she's some kind of social media expert that she's going to be able to put Mashiach on the internet? I don't know. But there is this woman called Mevaseret Tzion, the herald who announces the coming of Mashiach. So some people see that as a metaphorical idea and not an actual woman. But anyway, there's different possibilities. The Zohar also says in another place that Rachel will come back. because remember Jeremiah 31 that we read last time, God is telling Rachel, min ikolech mi bechi, don't cry. Rachel is still in exile. She never found peace because she's in exile with her children. So the Zohar also speaks about Rachel coming back. So there are at least 2, 3, or 4 ladies involved in this. And so there's a whole team Mashiach. Okay, it's not even just necessarily one. So Ve'alu Moshiim, when saviors shall arise, it's not necessarily just one person or 2 people. It could very well be 20 people, right? Yeah, exactly. And so now this is where we get to the juicy part. And it starts with a discussion of women, actually. In the Gemara, in Masechet Sukkah, the discussion about Mashiach ben Yosef is actually introduced first through a discussion of women. Women in the temple. This is what it says. This is on one page earlier, on page 51. Tanu Rabbanan. So in those days when they would celebrate Sukkot, and if you remember on Sukkot, they had the biggest party of the year was on Sukkot, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. They had this water drawing ceremony, they had crazy parties, and the Gemara says if you were never at a party like this, you've never been to a party, right? Like this is the greatest party of all time. The rabbis were breakdancing, there were jugglers, there was like fire, people like pyromaniacs doing things. There was barbecues for everybody. It was like an amazing event. It was the event of the year, right? The Sukkah festival. So it says, Berishana yu nashim mi bifnim ve'anashim mi bachutz. So originally, during these Sukkah celebrations, the women would be inside in the women's courtyard, and the men would be on the outside. Ve'ayu ba'im leyadei kalut rosh. But unfortunately, what happens when men and women party together, they would come to too much fun. So, they would come to levity. That is the translation here. So they would do things. So then the rabbi said, okay, we have to fix this business. Hitkinu sheyu nashim yoshvot mibachutz. And they said, let's mix it around. Let's make the women go on the outside and ve'anashim mibifnim, and put the men inside. Ve'adayin ayu ba'im le'adei kalut rosh. And again, they would still come to levity. Okay, so then what? So then they said, let's put the women on top, on the balconies, and then put the men, and put the men below. So that's how they solved the problem of mingling between men and women at this party. Now, how do we know, who said the rabbis are even allowed to separate men and women? We need a source for that. How do we know that we need to separate men and women, whether it's in a shul or in the temple or wherever? How do we know that men and women shouldn't be together, like in the churches or wherever, in the Reform synagogues, where men and women sit together? How do we know that we have to keep them separate? Amar Rav, it's based on a verse. They found a verse to give them support to institute this practice of separating the men and women. And where is this verse from? From Zechariah. From Zechariah's prophecy of the end of days. What does it say there in chapter 12? V'safda ha'aretz, and the whole land will eulogize and will mourn, mishpachot levad, all the families separately, mishpachat Beit David levad, unshem levad. That the family of King David will mourn, or the house of David will mourn separately, and the women will mourn separately. So the rabbis say, look, you see, Amru ve'alot dvarim kal v'chomer. Isn't it obvious? It's a kal v'chomer. It's an a fortiori argument. Uma le'atid lavo she'oskin be'efsed ve'ein yetzara sholed b'hem. So they're saying, look, in the end of days, the evil inclination will be destroyed. There will be no more evil. And yet, still, when they are mourning at the end of days, and when you're mourning, nobody's in the mood to frolic, men and women, and still they're separated. Even in a eulogy, the men and women are separated, right? So, עכשיו שעסוקים בשמחה ויצר השולט בהם, now when we're partying, and we do have the yetzer hara, and evil is still rampant, al achat kama vekama. How much more so should we separate men and women in public gatherings? That's what the Gemara says. So Zechariah is saying that in the end of days, the people are going to be mourning, and the men and women are going to mourn separately. That's a clear verse in the Tanakh. The prophet says men and women mourn separately. So the rabbis are coming and saying, look, if at that point in the future when there's no evil and everybody's sad and they're still separating the men and women, so how much more so now when there is evil and we're in a state of happiness and not sadness in a party, of course we should separate men and women. Make sense? And that's a segue into the Mashiach ben Yosef discussion. How so? Let's jump to Zechariah chapter 12. What does it say? It's describing, again, the final apocalyptic war, Gog uMagog, right? And it says, V'aya bayom ha'u, on that day, asim et Yerushalayim even ma'amasa lechol ha'amim. So again, as we saw before, and all the other prophets say the same thing in slightly different words. All the nations of the world are going to gather against Israel, against Jerusalem. They're all going to be there. Right? We saw Yoel said that, Jeremiah said that, Isaiah says, all the prophets say it. In Psalms it says it. Throughout the Tanakh we see the same thing. This final Gog uMagog war, when all the nations of the world will gather to Israel.
This is not a double prophecy.
This has never happened yet. This is definitely a future. Because Zechariah is already in the Second Temple era. Right? So this hasn't happened yet. And again, this is another way to eliminate any messianic pretender. Because again, this has never happened yet. This is something that's going to happen in the future. And we're going to have to, again, define exactly what does it mean that all the nations of the world come against Israel. And v'nasfu aleh kol goei haaretz, so all the nations of the world will come against it. Bayom ha'u na'um Hashem akeh kol sus, and God will strike down all of the horses. We talked about the symbolism of the horse, the symbol as a symbol of war at the end of days. And then it says, I'm going to skip ahead a few verses. I'm going to destroy all these foreigners that are coming to fight against my people, against Jerusalem. So God is saying, I will spill all my compassion and pity upon the house of David and upon Jerusalem. And this is the key verse. Ve'ebitu elai, and they will look to me, et asher dakaru, they will look to me because of those who were slain, who were stabbed. Ve'safdu alav, and they will mourn him, now in the singular, kemisped ala yechid, as if they would mourn a single child, an only child. Ve'hamer alav ke'amer al bechor, and they will have grief over, apparently him in the singular, as one would have grief over their firstborn. And remember last time we said, who is the firstborn? What did Jeremiah say? Israel banai hem, right? Ve'Ephraim bechorihu. So Mashiach that was the whole thing of Kolato, that Mashiach ben Yosef Ephraim is the first so-called firstborn, is Mashiach ben Yosef. So now these things come together. But what does that really mean? They're mourning. There's going to be a great war in Jerusalem. A bunch of people are going to die. People are going to be mourning. And then God is going to have pity on them. And then they're going to mourn. Who are they mourning over? It seems to switch from, first it implies people mourning because there's a lot of death. But then it switches to the singular. And it's saying they're going to mourn over him.
Who got stabbed?
Right. Somebody who got stabbed. Somebody who got dakaru, asher dakaru. Somebody who got slain and stabbed.
Can't this just be when in Isaiah it switches between the
Yeah. Right. So you can read this as, it's just talking about a group of people in the singular. Right? Like all of them, they're mourning over that body of people that was killed. For sure. Good. But the Talmud doesn't necessarily, this is what the Talmud is going to now discuss. So going back to the Talmud, it says, okay, this hesped, this eulogy, who is it for? Who are they crying for? So Zechariah says the people are crying over somebody or something or whatever that was slain. Pligi ba Rabbi Dosa ve'Rabbanan. So Rabbi Dosa and the other rabbis are having a debate. They dispute this idea, who this is talking about. Chad Amar, one says, Al Mashiach ben Yosef shene'erag. Rabbi Dosa is saying it's about Mashiach ben Yosef who is killed. So now this is the first time we actually see Mashiach ben Yosef. This is the source of Mashiach ben Yosef. Rabbi Dosa is saying this person in Zechariah is Mashiach ben Yosef. And the Rabbanan, other rabbis, the rabbinic majority say, no, al yetzer hara shenerag. It's talking about the evil inclination that will be destroyed. Evil will be destroyed. Good. That's what the Gemara is going to ask. Why would they mourn if evil's destroyed? They should be happy, right? The rabbis are asking your question. They're saying, Bishlema leman de'amar al Mashiach ben Yosef shene'erag. Okay, so somebody who's saying that it's about Mashiach ben Yosef makes sense. It's about a person because it says, Ki dichtiv ve'ibitu alay et asher dakaru v'safdu alav. Because the verse seems to be talking about somebody in the singular. Makes perfect sense. They killed somebody. They're mourning over this guy that was killed. And that's Mashiach ben Yosef. But for those who say, Ela leman de'amar al yetzer hara shenerag, but for those who say that it was the yetzer hara, what does that have to do with anything? Why would they be sad? They should be simcha ba'ele. They should be happy. There should be simcha that evil is destroyed. Amai bachu. Why are they crying? So what does it say? Kida daresh Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda explains it. Le'atid lavo, in the future, mavio HaKadosh Baruch Hu leyetzer hara v'shochato bifnei tzadikim u'bifnei harashaim. When God will slay the evil inclination, the embodiment of evil, and we'll see later the Midrash will identify this, of course, as Satan, basically. God will destroy the Satan and all of his minions, the Sitra Achra. God will destroy the Yetzer Hara.
So the sinners are going to be the ones crying.
So let's see. Tzadikim nidme lahem kehar gavoa. For the righteous, this will look like God is bringing down a great mountain. U'reshaim nidme lahem kechut ha'se'ara. And for the wicked, it will appear like a little string that got cut. Like a tiny little string. Halalu bochin ve'halalu bochin. And everybody's going to be crying. Why is everybody crying? Tzadikim bochin ve'omrin. The righteous will cry and say, Ha'ech yacholnu lichbosh har gavoa kazeh. How is it that we were able to overcome so much evil and stay righteous? So the righteous are going to cry like, wow, how did we do this? Evil was so powerful and we were able to overcome it. And the sinners, Rashaim bochin, the sinners will cry and say, Ha'ech lo yacholnu lichbosh et chut ha'se'ara hazeh. How were we not able to conquer this little string? Right? It was something, evil was so easy to subdue. It was like a little tiny string, and we succumbed to it. So the wicked are crying because they realize how they could have overcome evil and they didn't. The righteous are crying because they're saying, wow, evil was so powerful and somehow we were able to do it. And so everybody's crying. Very beautiful. Okay. V'akadosh Baruch Hu tamei imahem. And God is also with them, will be amazed. Shene'emar ko amar Hashem tzvaot, and it brings a verse to prove it, also from Zechariah, in a different place, in chapter 8, ko amar Hashem tzvaot, ki ipale be'einei she'arit ha'am hazeh be'yamim ha'em, gam be'einai ipale. That there will be something wondrous in the eyes of all the people, and even in my eyes, God is saying. It'll be something wondrous even in my eyes. That's the proof verse from Zechariah himself. So that's how the Gemara explains your question. Now, going back to that debate, we're not done yet. We're not done this Gemara. So going back to the debate, Rabbi Dosa is saying it's about Mashiach ben Yosef. The rabbis are saying no, it's about the evil inclination that's being killed. Now, before we even go any further, if we understand basic Talmudic principles, how are we supposed to actually understand this one sentence? Rabbi Dosa's opinion versus the rabbinic majority, versus Rabbanan. What do we generally do when you're presented with two interpretations, one of an individual and one of a majority? Right. Generally speaking, we reject the individual for the majority. Not always, but generally speaking, we follow the majority, what the Rabbanan say. Rabbi Dosa is basically throwing his individual opinion. That's just his opinion. And then you have all the rabbis saying, no. It's not about Mashiach ben Yosef who's going to die. Because remember what we said last time. All of part 1 was how Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't need to die. And we saw all the sources in the Tanakh that he doesn't need to die. So they're saying, no, he doesn't need to die. It has nothing to do with that. They're not crying over Mashiach ben Yosef. They're crying over the evil inclination. So right away, you can actually completely reject Rabbi Dosa's opinion according to the actual general Talmudic principles of learning, and say that Rabbi Dosa's opinion is completely irrelevant. It's his own individual opinion, and we don't generally follow individuals. And that's actually what the Rambam does, because the Rambam, Maimonides, he codified the whole Talmud, right? He made the Mishnah Torah. And he even promises in the Mishnah Torah that he did the job for you, and he's codified, he's given you all the proper conclusions and all the actual true opinions, and he filtered out all the irrelevant opinions, and he says, this is all you need. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, in his introduction, says, Eino tzarich sefer acher. You just need this book. This book will tell you everything you need to know. So the Rambam, when he codifies this in Ilchot Melachim, he does not even mention Mashiach ben Yosef. Not explicitly. There's only Mashiach ben David. Because the whole Talmud only mentions Mashiach ben Yosef here this one time. That's it. The Talmud never again speaks about Mashiach ben Yosef. He's only mentioned here, and he's only a singular opinion of Rabbi Dosa. And so the Rambam does what he always does. He codifies the law, and he's saying this individual opinion is nothing. It's completely irrelevant. And the only person that he speaks about, the Rambam, is Mashiach ben David. He never speaks about Mashiach ben Yosef. According to the Rambam, there's no such thing.
Is it true that when you have a machloket, Rabbim versus one guy, even when it has nothing to do with halacha, that we have to go by majority? I think I saw Ari Kaplan say, especially regarding
when it comes to Agada, you don't have to, right? There is such an idea. But the Rambam's codifying this as actual law. He's putting it in Ilchot Melachim. These are the laws of kings. So the Rambam's not treating this like an Agadic issue. The Rambam's actually treating this like a mamash halachic issue. Because it's not Agada, though. It's not a philosophical discussion. It's real. Like, what's going to happen when Mashiach comes? We need to know who is Mashiach, right? This is the laws of kings. So the Rambam does not treat this as Agada. He treats this as halacha. And he completely rejects Mashiach ben Yosef. Doesn't even mention him. And you'll see in his language, he actually does allude to this Gemara. The Rambam never gives us sources, but you can see in his language, he's clearly connecting to this Gemara. It's beautiful. So let's just go through it really quickly. In the Rambam in the Ilchot Melachim, he says, where he explains what kind of Mashiach, how do we know who's Mashiach, what is he supposed to do. ואל יעלה על דעתך שהמלך המשיח צריך לעשות אותות ומופתים ומחדש דברים בעולם, או מחיי מתים. Don't think that Mashiach has to do miracles. He does not have to work miracles. God does the miracles. Mashiach does not have to work miracles. He does not have to resurrect the dead. You know who that's an allusion to. He doesn't have to even be מחיי מתים. וכיוצא בדברים האלה, or anything like that. Ein hadavar kach. Doesn't have to be like this. Sharei, and he brings an example. Rabbi Akiva chacham gadol mechachmei mishnah haya. Remember what happened with Rabbi Akiva? Exactly. Ayahu noseh kelav shel ben Koziva amelech. Rabbi Akiva would literally be the arms bearer for Shimon bar Koziva, and we talked about him last time as a potential Mashiach of his generation, right? Kol HaTorah actually says he was the potential Messiah of his generation, and Rabbi Akiva declared him to be the presumptive Messiah. So of course he was a potential Messiah, an actual legitimate potential Messiah. But he failed. Ve'hu haya omer alav shu melech HaMashiach. Rabbi Akiva insisted that he is the potential Messiah, is the Messiah. V'dimahu v'chol chachmei doro shehu melech HaMashiach. They all thought he would be the Messiah, and he got very far. We said last time that of all the messianic pretenders in history, Bar Kokhba got the closest, because he actually did fight the Romans, did expel them, did start building the third temple, did start minting coins, reestablished an independent Jewish state, started an ingathering of exiles, only for a short period of time, but he actually did all these things. So,
was he a Judite from the David?
Yeah. Absolutely. So he was the closest out of everybody that got to being actually Mashiach. Ad sheneherag be'avonot. And because of his sins or whatever, got killed. Or because of various sins, he got killed. Kevan sheneherag noda lahem she'eino. As soon as he was killed, they know that he cannot be the Messiah. Okay? Because Judaism does not believe in a dead Messiah. Once a person's dead, he cannot be Mashiach. And look at the word that he uses. He specifically uses the word neherag. It's the exact same word that Rabbi Dosa used and the Talmud uses, right? Al-Mashiach ben Yosef sheneherag. So the Rambam very beautifully is using the exact same language as in the Gemara, telling you how you're supposed to read that Gemara. The neherag part, it's clear. Once a person's dead, he's not Mashiach. So Lubavitchers like to jump on this word and say, hey, the Rebbe could still be Mashiach because he wasn't neherag, he wasn't killed. He died of natural causes. That's not being killed, right? So they're playing with words here. But the Rambam's choice of words is actually exact. He uses neherag because the Gemara uses neherag, right? And again, his job is to codify the Gemara. Okay, so, ועיקר הדברים ככה הן, שהתורה הזאת חוקיה ומשפטיה לעולם ולעולמי עולמים. So again, the Rambam is saying this is the law. He's not treating this as an agadic issue. He's saying this is the law of the Torah. ואין מוסיפין עליהם ולא גורעין מהם. And you can't add anything to this or remove anything to this. This is it. This is the law. And then the Rambam just says, how will we know who is Mashiach? ואם יעמוד מלך מבית דוד, הוגה בתורה ועוסק במצוות כדוד אביו. If one should arise from the house of David, who meditates upon the Torah all the time and fulfills all mitzvot, כפי תורה שבכתב ושבעל פה, fulfills the written Torah, the oral Torah, ויחוף כל ישראל לילך בה, and he, whatever it is, encourages and even more so pushes people to observe Torah law. וילחם מלחמות השם, and he fights the wars of God. So again, the Rambam has like a singular Messiah. There's no warrior Mashiach ben Yosef and then Mashiach ben David. It's one person who fights the wars of God, like King David fought the wars. הרי זה בחזקת שהוא משיח. This person is the presumptive Messiah. And then, אם עשה והצליח, if he succeeded in all these things, הוא בנה Mikdash bimkomo, and he built the temple in its place, v'kibetz nidchei Israel, and he gathered all the exiles, arei ze Mashiach bevadai. Then we know for sure he's Mashiach. How do we know a person's Mashiach? When somebody brings all the Jews back to Israel and rebuilds the temple in its place. Right. If somebody can accomplish that, you are Mashiach. Okay? And that's no easy feat. Right? That's a big deal to be able to do that.
So he ignores this whole concept
Yes.
of Mashiach ben Yosef altogether.
Completely. Because he's saying even the ingathering of the exiles, which Kol HaTov, last time we were saying, that's the Mashiach ben Yosef process. The Rambam says, no, it's all Mashiach ben David. It's one person. So then we know that person's Mashiach bevadai. Ve'itaken et ha'olam kulo le'avodat Hashem. And then he will fix the whole world and establish for the whole world to worship the one true God, to make the whole world monotheistic, which again, of course, still hasn't happened. Ve'im lo itzliach ad כה, and if he didn't succeed, on neherag, so either he didn't succeed, or he was killed, or he died, whatever it is. Be'yadua she'einu ze she'evticha alav Torah. For sure we know that this person is not who the Torah is speaking of when it speaks about Mashiach. Ve'arei hu, so who is such a person? Arei hu kechol malchei Beit David hashlamim aksherim shemetu. He's like another tzaddik from the house of David. We've had many in the past, right? And probably the Lubavitch Rebbe was one of these people who was a potential, but didn't succeed. Once the person's dead, we don't need to. We got to move on. That's it. So the Rambam completely rejects Rabbi Dosa's opinion. It's an individual opinion. It doesn't matter. So of course the next question for our Talmudical minds is, if it doesn't matter, why bring it up? Why does the Talmud even mention it? Why would the Talmud even mention it if it has no meaning, if it has no validity, and it's never mentioned again anywhere in the Talmud? Why bring it up? Why do you think?
Could this be like a foreign idea that made it into the Talmud? Like there are many.
Right, good. So I think this was my controversial idea that I was going to bring up. Because think about it. The Talmud was published around the year 500. So this is obviously happening in a time when there are already Christians. There are already people who believe in a dead Messiah. Rabbi Dosa himself, by the way, lived in the 1st century. So he was very aware. He might have even been a witness to this whole messianic movement at the time. And interestingly enough, his name, Dosa, what is that? That's not a Jewish name. Who, what, since when? What is Dosa? And there's only a few sages called Dosa or Dostai. It's the same name. Dosa is short for Dosatheo. It's a Greek name, which means gift of God, like God-given. Nathanael would have been his Hebrew name. All right, so Dosa is a Greek name. His full name is Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. He is a Greek name, son of a Greek name, right? Dosatheo ben Hyrcanus. So this is somebody who is very well knowledgeable of the Greek world, of the non-Jewish world. In fact, we're reading Pirkei Avot now, right? Don't forget. This Shabbat, you have to start reading Pirkei Avot, chapter 1. Every week we read one chapter of Pirkei Avot from Pesach to Shavuot. And Rabbi Dosa is mentioned in Pirkei Avot. He's one of our sages. And what does he teach? Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas Omer, what does he say? Anybody remember? Reuben, you know it by heart, no? Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus, what does he say? Chapter 3, verse 10. Shena shel shacharit sleeping in the morning, ve'yain shel tzoraim. Good. And sleeping in the morning and drinking alcohol in the afternoon, or drinking wine in the noontime, ve'sichat hayeladim, and childish banter, ve'yeshivat batei chnesiot shel amei haaretz, and going to the chnesiot shel amei haaretz, going to the churches of the ignorant people, motziin et ha'adam min ha'olam, remove a person from this world. So Rabbi Dosa is very well aware of the churches of the Amei Haaretz, okay, and again, remember when he lived. He's living at this time period, right, when this movement is taking off. So Rabbi Dosa is very clearly aware of what's going on. So what I think is really happening here is, in classic Talmudic fashion, Rabbi Dosa is playing the devil's advocate. So the rabbis are saying this is clearly talking about this time at the end of days when evil will be destroyed. And Rabbi Dosa is saying, hey, but what about, he's playing the devil's advocate. He's saying, but what about all those people out there today, those Jews and others who believe in a certain Messiah, the son of Joseph, because literally Jesus was the son of Joseph and Mary. What about those people who say that their Messiah, that son of Joseph, was killed? And they read it, because we know the Christians do read this as referring to Jesus' crucifixion. So what Rabbi Dosa is saying, I think, is he's saying, hey, rabbis, what about them? What do you say to them who believe in the son of Joseph, who's their Messiah, and they think this verse in Zechariah is talking about him, and they're mourning for his death? And the rabbis, of course, reject that argument entirely. And the Rambam codifies that as law.
Very good.
Works? I think it works.
We don't see them the same thing also, because we say that's the Yetzirah right there. Sometimes you can bridge what they both are saying.
Right, so that's what we're going to have to do in part 3, because we're out of time. But because we're going to have to figure out we've just really scratched the surface here now, and we haven't completed the passage. Let's just put everything together here. So what it seems to be is, I think what the pshat way, the simplest way to read it is, Rabbi Dosa is basically being the devil's advocate, presenting an opinion to the rabbis who obviously don't read this as referring to any Mashiach, but he's saying, hey, what about those who believe in a dying Messiah and say this verse refers to him? So I think that's what's really going on here, and the rabbis are rejecting that notion. That's why he's never again mentioned in the Talmud. But then later in Midrash and in Zohar and in later texts, Mashiach ben Yosef takes on a life of his own. So it's a controversial idea, because it's almost like, did a Christian idea accidentally enter the Talmud and then from there spread to later sources? That's why it's such a dangerous idea. And I think that's why so many people avoid, like I said last time, talking about Mashiach ben Yosef entirely. Because maybe the sages never intended for there to be any talk of Mashiach ben Yosef. And that's, I think, what the Rambam understood. And that's why he never mentions Mashiach ben Yosef at all. He just completely ignores any discussion of Mashiach ben Yosef and says it's all Mashiach ben David. And yet, there is this Mashiach ben Yosef idea. And you'll find that every messianic movement, from Jesus through everybody in between, and the Shabbatayans and Lehavdil, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, all grasp and hold on to this Mashiach ben Yosef idea and go with Rabbi Dosa, go with the rejected opinion of Rabbi Dosa. And why do they do that? They have to go with that opinion. Why? Because their Messiah didn't fulfill anything that Mashiach is supposed to do. Exactly. So they have to go with that opinion. And they have to say, oh, well, dying isn't the end. It's okay. He'll come back. And so every messianic movement ends up believing indefinitely in a Messiah that will come in some future time. Christians are waiting 2,000 years already, and they won't give it up. Right? And they'll spam my YouTube comments with like, oh, one day you Jews will realize that Jesus is the Messiah. No, it's been 2,000 years. Forget about it. Right? Like, and whatever it is. And I want to devote a separate class to the Shabbatayans and the Frankists, but the same idea that of waiting for their Shabtai Tzvi to return, and Lehavdil, the Lubavitchers who are waiting for him to return. It's been 30 years since he passed away, but they still believe more strongly than ever. And recently I asked the Lubavitcher, we had a debate about, and he still believes very much that the Rebbe will return. And I said, yeah, but like when, like how long are you going to believe? And he says, well, there's a Rashi, and I'll get to that Rashi maybe next time because we're out of time. There's a Rashi that says that Mashiach might come and disappear for maybe 45 years. There is such a Rashi, fine. So I said, okay, I'll give it to you. Let's say that there's this period of concealment for 45 years. So I'm going to say, what happens 16 years from now when it's the Lubavitch Rebbe's 46th yard site, right? So 45 years have passed. And I said, so on the 46th yard site, and I'm going to call you up, and I'm going to say, do you still believe the Rebbe is Mashiach? What do you think he told me? He said, of course I'm going to believe the Rebbe is Mashiach. So that's the problem. The problem is you're just going to keep extending the deadline. You're going to say, okay, 45 years passed, no problem. We'll wait another 100 years, and we'll wait another 1,000 years, and we'll wait 1,000 years from now. Of course, by then the real Mashiach will come, but let's say not. 1,000 years from now, Christians will still be waiting for Jesus to come back. They're going to still be spamming my YouTube comments that you guys are going to one day see that Jesus was. So it just never ends. Once people are brainwashed to believe a certain guy is Mashiach, it's impossible to extricate them, almost impossible to take them out of that brainwashing. I'll end with this, just as to whet your appetite for part 3, which I was hoping to avoid, but okay, here we are. So we didn't finish the Talmud passage. Until now, everything sounds great. And it seems like we should just end here and go home and move on to the next topic. The problem is that the Talmud adds one more paragraph that ruins everything. This is how it ends. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, Mashiach ben David, good, she'atid leigalot b'meira b'yameinu, Mashiach ben David, who's destined to be revealed, God willing, soon. Omer lo Akadosh Baruch Hu. Okay. God asks him, Sha'al mimeni davar ve'etan lach. Ask me anything and I'll give it to you. So God asks Mashiach ben David, ask me anything and I'll give it to you. Shene'emar, because it's based on that verse in Psalms, which we quoted last time. The verse in Psalm says, Asapra el chok, Hashem amar elai, God told me, b'niyata, and the Gemara actually skips this particular word. I reinserted it. The Psalm says, God says, you are my son. Ani ayom yeliditicha. I begot you today. The Gemara says ani ayom, but it doesn't say b'niyata. It does ... and skips that part. So the verse says, God says to Mashiach, you are my son. I begot you today. Sha'al mimeni ve'etna goim nachalatecha. Ask me anything, I will give you, subdue all nations before you. So God says to Mashiach ben David, ask me anything. And what happens? Ve'keivan shera'a, and when he saw Mashiach ben Yosef sheneherag, when he sees Mashiach ben Yosef being killed, Omer lefanav, he says, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe. So Mashiach ben David says to God, Master of the universe, Eini mevakesh mimcha ela chaim. I only want life. And Omer lo, Chaim, ad shelo amarta kvar itnabe alecha David. God tells him, you want life? No problem. Your forefather, King David, already said, kvar itnabe alecha David avicha. King David, your forefather, already said this about you and already prayed for you and said, Chaim sha'al mimcha v'natatalo. You asked him he asked you for life and you gave it to him. And that's how the passage actually ends. So the passage ends by saying Mashiach ben David sees Mashiach ben Yosef get killed and tells God, hey, I want life. And God says, I gave you life. That's how the passage ends. So what do we make of that? And the Zohar and later sources reads it as if Mashiach ben Yosef, this is really talking about Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. And the Zohar actually in one place, earlier in the Zohar, not the Zohar we quoted last time, but it actually says that this is talking about Mashiach Achra Bare de Yosef, that other Messiah, the son of Yosef, that he's actually going to die. Yamut Mashiach da, veitkatel. He will be killed. He will die, he will be killed. Ve'yehei mit, and he will stay dead. Ad tilkot cha'in giv'ah, until life will be given to him from, it has a whole exposition of the high hill and the low hill. Giva, of a Giva Ila'a and a Giva Tata'a. The lower hill and the high hill, it's a little mystical. I'm not going to go into that now. But he's saying he will stay dead. Mashiach ben Yosef will die and he will be dead until life will be given to him, ve'yakum, and he'll come back to life. So the Zohar reads it as Mashiach ben Yosef really does die. Mashiach ben David prays for him, and he is resurrected. Which kind of throws everything in the garbage now. That confuses everything. Like, what do we do with that now? And
But is that part of the resurrection for everybody?
right. So there is a resurrection for everybody.
Yeah.
And so ultimately we pray for Tchiyat HaMetim for everyone.
Yeah.
Everybody will be resurrected at the end of days. So could this be that there is a person named Mashiach ben Yosef and he does get resurrected, but then everybody else follows in the resurrection? We'll see. We'll have to leave that for next time. Next time we'll explore the idea of resurrection and we'll try to put it all together. And I think there is one midrash that actually fixes all of these issues and puts it all together neatly. So we'll leave it for next time.